For those of you who might be of an older generation of USC alumni, my name is Urbashi Mitra, and I'm one of the faculty in the area. If you have any complaints about the technical program, I'm the person you complain to. Everything else I can't take responsibility for. So this is a workshop predominantly to honor all of you, our alumni, whose accomplishments we are so proud of. But I thought it would be prudent for us to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what CSI is like today. We perhaps can only at the moment aspire to the greatness of the Magnificent Seven, but as someone who's been here for the last 11, 12 years, I think I can say with some confidence that we are doing an excellent job of upholding that reputation. And so you'll hear from a few of us today. So our latest hire is Ben Reichart, who's standing here next to me. He's very new. He joined us just this year in 2012. If you take a look at his pedigree, it's a who's who of all of the great places in electrical engineering and in quantum. So he did his undergraduate at Stanford, went on to Berkeley for his PhD, did a postdoc a few miles away at Caltech, was an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, and now comes to us. His PhD was funded in part by 2 very prestigious fellowships from the National Science Foundation and the DoD, and as one of officially the old people of the CSI faculty, one of the things I always like to see is new people come in with money. And so Ben has been successful in securing ARO funding recently, of which we are very pleased. So Ben's going to talk a little bit about his research, which is in the quantum area. And for those of you who have been following the growth of CSI over the last few years, this is an area that we've made significant investments in through multiple hires. Todd Brunn, Daniel Lidar, also colleagues in physics. And it's one of the places in which we have a significant presence. And Ben will tell you a little bit about that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask a fairly simple but general question. So let's say you're given some device and you'd like to understand how it works. You'd like to understand what it does. And so it might be a computer and you're trying to test that the computer works as it's supposed to, or it might be some physical system and you're a physicist, you've built it or you found it and you want to understand what it does. And so how can you figure this out? One answer is to break the device apart, look at all the different pieces, see how they fit together, try to understand how it works in that way. But this isn't so easy. I mean, when you break the device apart, you break it, you can't necessarily use it anymore. Also, it's a complicated device, so when you take it apart, you might miss some pieces. Or maybe you just don't understand how all the pieces work when you take it apart. That's pretty common as well. And so let's say that you actually can't take it apart. Let's just say that you have to take the device as given to you as just essentially a black box, and you can give it inputs and see what the responses are. So then what can you do? Essentially, all you can do is you can run tests on the device. And so the idea is that you're going to run a bunch of tests on this and see if it passes the test, and hopefully if it passes all the tests, then it runs correctly when you give it an input that you actually care about. But still, this isn't such an easy problem, because you have to figure out what kinds of tests should you run. And it isn't necessarily easy to come up with good tests. For example, say that this device is supposed to be a supercomputer. It's supposed to be a very powerful device. It's much more powerful than you. You'd like to give it hard questions and check that it gives you the correct answers. But you're not smart enough, you're not fast enough to verify the answers yourself. So how do you come up with good tests if you can't even, I mean, how do you grade the tests if you don't know the answers yourself? We do this all the time, of course. This is why we ask students to show their work. But actually, seriously, there is a USC connection. So over here at ISI at Marina del Rey, we have what's called the D-Wave 1. So this is a big quantum computational device. I wouldn't call it a quantum computer. It's certainly not a general purpose quantum computer, but it does use quantum physics to try to solve interesting kinds of problems. And it appears to be quite powerful. Also, for this talk, it's quite nice because it comes literally as a black box. You can see it down there. And you can open it up, and if you open it up like this, it's quite complicated. And actually, we don't understand fully the physics of these superconducting qubits that make it up. So it is in one of these cases where we don't understand the individual pieces. So we'd like to come up with tests for this, and it's quite non-trivial to come up with tests for this kind of computer that's so powerful. Now, I'm really most interested in the most general situation possible. So we're going to place no restrictions whatsoever on this device. So it could be arbitrarily powerful. And we're not going to assume any model at all on how the device could be broken or how it could be faulty. Because in general, you don't know what the correct model for faults might be. And so what can you do? In this case, you really have to fall back on the very most conservative assumption. You have to assume that the device is actually malicious. It's trying to trick you. It's trying to pass all the tests you give it while giving you the wrong answer when you give it an actual problem that you care about. Now, of course, it's an extremely conservative assumption. It's not maybe it's not a realistic assumption. But if we don't have any better model for errors, if we're not entirely sure what the correct model for errors is, this is really the strongest. This is the best assumption we can make in the general case. And actually, even in some situations, this might be a good assumption. So, for example, if you're very concerned about security, you might be interested in implementing cryptographically secure operations while placing minimal trust, or no trust even, in the devices that you're using. And so, maybe before going further and telling you how we can start to solve this problem, let me give you an example of what kinds of practical applications this might have. Okay. So say you're the government and you want to communicate securely between the White House and maybe your embassy in Beijing or Moscow or something. So one way of doing this is when you have a message that you want to transmit, you write it down, you put it in a briefcase, you give it to a courier, and you fly it across the ocean. It's not very practical, of course. But of course, cryptography gives us better solutions. So what you can do is you can give a secret key to your courier, put that in the briefcase, send it across, and then in the future, when you want to communicate, you just encrypt your communication using this pre-distributed secret key. That's a perfectly fine solution. Using these results, we can come up with a different solution, which is, so it sounds a bit crazy. So here's the story. So you go onto Amazon, Amazon.com. You're going to order 2 special devices. They're going to be quantum mechanical devices, actually. But there's nothing else about them. So they're just, they're made in China, or they're made in Switzerland, or they're not trusted whatsoever. You have them shipped out with standard FedEx, or whatever Amazon offers. There's no special courier involved. You have one sent to the White House, one sent to your embassy. Now, when they arrive, this is important, you need to isolate the devices quite carefully. So you don't know what's going on inside this box. It could be sort of arbitrary. It could have a radio in there sending information out. You don't want that inside the White House. So you have to isolate them. You just lock them up in a lead box or something. And then, once you've done that, you can start giving these devices tests. And what we can do is we can come up with tests to give these boxes that guarantees that the boxes output secure random strings. So they output random strings. Each box outputs a random string of bits. It's the same on either end. And furthermore, we can prove that it's uncorrelated with anything else in the universe. So in particular, it's uncorrelated with the manufacturer of the device or your adversary who's trying to look over your shoulder to see your communications. Now, if you think about the story for even just a minute, it sounds quite implausible. Technically, I think it sounds impossible. I mean, how do we prove that the secret key that the devices are outputting, how do we prove that it wasn't pre-programmed into the device when it was manufactured and it's posted all over the internet or something? And this really requires quantum mechanics. If the devices were classical, that would be impossible to see. So this is where we're using that the boxes are quantum mechanical. You might also say that the story is implausible. I mean, it seems implausible that the US government would want to order its cryptography material off of Amazon. And okay, I'll grant you that. But it's actually just an exaggerated story. It's not completely implausible. It's just an exaggeration. Basically, there's three ways of distributing keys right now. One is this courier method that's called pre-distribution. The other is what's actually used on the internet. It's called public key cryptography. So schemes like RSA, they base security on the difficulty of some computational problem, such as they assume it's hard to factor numbers. The problem with these kinds of approaches is that we don't actually know that it's hard to factor numbers. It's just an assumption. And in fact, if we can build a quantum computer, that will be a false assumption, because quantum computers can factor numbers efficiently. So in the long term, certainly, this does not offer security. The third approach is what's called quantum key distribution, or QKD. And this has no computational hardness assumptions at all. It just works assuming that quantum physics is correct. So it's just based on the laws of physics. Unfortunately, all three of these approaches can be insecure. So they're subject to attacks that are called side channel attacks. A side channel attack is any attack that's not accounted for in the mathematical security model for your crypto system. So for example, sometimes it's possible to ask your computer to encrypt certain messages. And based on the delay it takes for the computer to encrypt the message, you can sometimes figure out what the secret key is. So this is a side channel because normally we don't think about the timing of the CPU when we're worried about the security of the crypto system. Similarly, quantum key distribution can be subject to these kinds of side channel attacks. And the way we deal with them is always quite similar. We come up with, after an attack is published, we come up with a countermeasure, or somebody comes up with a countermeasure. They improve the systems. Another attack is eventually found. There's another countermeasure, and so on. So you sort of have security increasing in these steps. But using our approach, using these tests, we can avoid this. Because you see, we're not making any assumptions whatsoever on the devices. We're allowing them to be malicious, completely adversarial. And so in a sense, we can say that there's provably no side channel attacks, because there is no mathematical model for the devices. Okay, so briefly, how does this all work? How do we get this working? It starts with this paper by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen back in 1935. And if you haven't seen this paper, I definitely recommend that you read it. It's one of the top 2 or 3 most cited physics papers of all time. And basically, they proposed a certain experiment. I won't go into the details, but it works roughly like this. I create 2 photons. I send one photon that way, say to Alice. I send one photon to Bob over there. And what happens is, whatever direction Alice measures the polarization of her photon in, if Bob does the same measurement, they'll always get opposite answers. So if Alice measures up, down, left, right, and she gets up, down, Bob will always get left, right. If they both measure in 45-degree, minus 45-degree basis, and Alice gets plus 45 degrees, Bob will get minus 45 degrees. And Einstein called this spooky. He called it spooky action at a distance, because how could Bob's photon know what Alice's measurement result was? Right? This experiment works even if Alice and Bob are on opposite sides. Alice is on Earth and Bob is on Mars. But instantaneously, somehow Bob's photon knows what it's supposed to do. And so Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen proposed that there's much more to photons, possibly, than what meets the eye. So they said that possibly with a photon, it comes with it an infinite list of what are called hidden variables. And these variables, they say what the photon is going to do for every possible measurement. And so these 2 lists, they're created when the photons are created together. And then when they're separated, they still have the list sitting around. So a photon, it just looks like a point particle. But actually attached to the photon, there's this huge list that we just can't see, but that explains these kinds of very counterintuitive or paradoxical experiments. So Clauser, Horn, Shimoni, and Holt, 30-odd years later, said that actually this is wrong. This is impossible. And I won't go into the details at all, but I'll just say, I'll abstract it out completely. I'll abstract away all of the physics, and it works as follows. You say that Alice's detector is over here on the left, Bob on the right. You input a random bit to Alice, you input a random bit to Bob, and you get back bits as response. And what one can check quite carefully, quite easily, is that any classical strategy for these devices can succeed can have the XOR of the responses, the sum mod 2 of the responses, equal to the product of the inputs with probability at most 3/4. Whereas a quantum mechanical system, a truly quantum mechanical system, can pass this, can satisfy this predicate with 85% probability. And so here's a test. We just play this game. We run this experiment 1 million times, for example. And we see if they pass 800,000 tests. So if they do, we say they're quantum. If they don't, we say they're classical. And it is possible for classical boxes to pass this test, but it's 10 to the minus 700. It's extremely unlikely, one can check, just by basic statistics. And so we're going to start with this, and then we're going to build from it much more. So this gives us a test for distinguishing whether a system is quantum mechanical or whether it's classical physics. We'd like to do much more. We'd like to understand exactly what the state of the system is, and we'd like to be able to fully control the system. And it starts by just showing that the optimal quantum strategy for that game is unique. So there's only one way of achieving 85% success probability. And in fact, it's robust. So if you win with probably 84%, then you have to be close to that unique strategy. And this is really a unique quantum mechanical feature. You can't have a theorem like this classically for any classical game. Secondly, we say that, in fact, if you play many of these tests in sequence, there's still, in a sense, a unique optimal strategy. So essentially, the optimal strategy is you have to play the games independently. You can't correlate the strategies for different games. And this is much more technical. It's about 10 to the 700 times harder to prove. But this is really the basis. Essentially, this gives us a way of not just testing that a device is quantum mechanical. It lets us test that it's scalable. It's a scaled quantum mechanical device. There's lots of quantumness going on inside it. And this is how we bootstrap it. We combine that with, that's the key theorem. We combine that then with different kinds of subprotocols, and we can force the devices then to do whatever kinds of circuits or operations we would like. And in particular, one of the applications is this quantum key distribution protocol where we have no assumptions on the devices whatsoever. Actually, these are the only 4 assumptions that we need. We need isolation, we need quantum theory, we need random bits, and we need authenticated channel. Unfortunately, this isn't yet practical, so that's something we're still working on, and there's other problems like that. You might also notice that I didn't really solve the problem I set out. I set out to say you're given just one system and you want to understand it. What we actually can do is if you're given 2 systems and they're isolated from each other, either because of space-time, because they're really far apart, or because you put them in lead boxes, in this case, we can characterize what's going on inside. But we don't yet understand what happens if there's just one. Briefly, let me say something about what's going on at USC on other things in quantum computing. There's a lot of other very interesting things going on. Essentially, I think in terms of building a quantum computer, there's 3 main roadblocks. There's overcoming noise in quantum systems. There's architecting a quantum computer, figuring out how it all fits together, and there's actually scaling it up. And we have projects for all 3 of these. And here are some of the faculty. I think I probably missed some of us. And here are some of the courses that we've offered recently. So certainly, if you see any of us around, feel free to ask us questions, and we'd be happy to explain. All right, thanks.
So I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, who is Giuseppe Caire. And in the spirit of numbers that we've been doing, when you can start telling these numbers, you know that you are of a certain generation. But I've known Giuseppe now 21 years. And it's been a very fruitful friendship and collaboration, and I hope it will last some integer multiple of 21 years more. So Giuseppe got all of his degrees from the Politecnico di Torino, except for a key one, which is a master's degree from Princeton, which is where I met him. He's had a number of different positions, including at Torino, the European Space Agency, but we stole him from the Eurocom Institute in the south of France. And I feel that it's quite telling that we were able to pull him away from the Côte d'Azur to lovely downtown LA, if you will. He, like many of my colleagues in CSI, has a very storied history and background and accolades. He's won a number of Best Paper Awards, including the Jack Neubauer Best Paper Award from the Vehicular Technology Society. He's probably one of the few people who's won 2 joint Information Theory Society and Communication Society Best Paper Awards in 2004 and then most recently in 2011. He's an IEEE Fellow. He's been a former president of the Information Theory Society. And perhaps we will see some taste of it during the next couple of days, but he's also an extremely accomplished pianist. So without any further ado, Giuseppe.
Thank you very much. Does it work? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so this presentation is say highlight on a project that involves several people in CSI. So I chose this specific topic because it's not only myself, but also Andy Molish, Alex Dimakis, Mike Neely, and a crowd of very bright and productive PhD students. So let's talk about the motivation. The motivation of this project, which is called the Video-Aware Wireless Networks, is essentially captured by this picture that this is a projection made by Cisco about the increase in internet traffic. And the biggest responsible for this increase is mobile video. Mobile video is really what people want, is enabled by these nice devices that we all have, like the iPhone and the iPad, and I should say also Samsung Galaxy to be fair. And unfortunately, it doesn't work. Everybody has the very unpleasant experience of streaming, for example, YouTube or Netflix at home from your favorite Wi-Fi network, and it works. Try to do this in a park where you are on a base station, a cellular base station. It does not really work. And in addition, well, operators got scared by this picture. This picture captures essentially costs and revenues. And you see a very clear boundary there, a big change in the slope of volume of network traffic and costs that crosses the revenues. And this is when essentially the big switch between voice and data happen in wireless. So this motivates essentially the project. And this project was started with a call for proposals made by Intel and Cisco in their academic research office, and a consortium of several universities, including Cornell, USC, UT Austin, and UCSD, has essentially gotten various angles, various sub-projects. And what we did is the following. So we focused on essentially next generation, kind of futuristic view beyond cellular. Let me just briefly say what, our motivations. So everybody agrees about the fact that there is a sort of spectrum crunch. Even in the popular press, there is not enough wireless bandwidth. There are some new channels that will be released. Google is lobbying to open them up to like dynamic access, and traditional operators like AT&T and Verizon wants to buy them. Anyway, when you count how many megahertz of bandwidth this will be essentially a factor of 2 with respect to what is today, including everything, including also Wi-Fi. So it's a factor of 2. But we have to increase capacity by a factor of 100. So it's 2 orders of magnitude, it's not a factor of 2. And everybody who knows the Shannon theory knows that capacity is linear with bandwidth, right? It's W log S log of 1 plus SNR in the best case. Okay, so what about improving technology? Going to LTE, going to OFDM, et cetera, et cetera. Again, you get another factor of 2, maybe, if you're lucky. But really, the major difference that makes this factor of 100 is going to a much denser deployment of infrastructure, making cells 10 meters radius. And everybody understands that this cannot work with conventional cellular technology. You cannot have a tower every 10 meters, right? So you need to have a very different type of network architectures where you have a cellular umbrella that fills in the gaps and take care of the few mobile users. There are we keep talking about mobile communications, but the users that use this type of data are less and less mobile. We all sit when we watch a movie, we don't drive, and actually it's forbidden even to, to talk on the phone now when you're driving. So mobile users are a minority. The biggest users are nomadic users. And for them, for those users, you can distribute base stations everywhere, small stations, but not bigger than an iPhone, and with enough memory, enough caching capacity to store most of what the user wants without relying on a fast backhaul. Because the problem is, if you have such a dense deployment of infrastructure, how do you create the backhaul? You should put fiber optical everywhere, in parks, in stations, and we all know that this is not true, right? So we need to leverage caching. So, okay, this is just a picture that says that more spectrum, frequency division, historically from 1950, well, they have contributed by these small numbers. Spectrum reuse, which means that going denser and denser, has contributed by many more orders of magnitudes. And okay, I'm gonna probably skip a little bit of information theory. This is just a motivation of the fact that as smart as you can get with MIMO, as many antennas you can put in your base stations, if you insist on conventional cellular technology with, say, 1 kilometer wide macro cells, well, you get stuck. Whatever you do, there are fundamental limits, upper bounds, information theoretic upper bounds, that tell you that your per link rate will go to 0 as 1 over the number of users. However, there are also other fundamental scaling laws of device-to-device networks that say that, in fact, the transport capacity of a device-to-device network scales like order of square root of n, where n is the number of nodes, which still, if you transport data across the network, would give you a rate per link that goes to 0 as 1 over square root of n, which is not such a negative device as before, but it's still quite negative. However, if you make the source destination at small distance, a distance 1 over square root of n, if you are on a grid, say unit grid, essentially means you're getting your destination in one hop. Well, guess what? The per throughput, per link throughput is order of 1. So you get a completely scalable system. And how you create this network with the source and destination are very close. Well, you cache the content next to the users, which means cache the content by predictive caching directly into the user devices or into the box near them. There are some people who say that there will be more base stations than users. And there will be, small base station embedded in like architectural features, like in Windows frames and in your walls. And we all know that we have a lot of memory. So this is, when I talk about caching in networks, people say, okay, this is an old story. Akamai already does it, which is true. But this is the picture. So we have the core network, we have the overlay, classical Akamai content distribution network, and then we have a big wall here. This wall is the last mile, is your DSL line, is only 1 megabit per second in most of the places. When you get 10 megabits per second, you're very lucky. In my home in South Pasadena, for example, I tried to have a UVerse installed, and they couldn't. The link is not good enough. Okay? And then you have the wireless, and you have the wireless, and you would like to see your video on your iPhone. So essentially, the idea is video and this type of internet access is highly predictable. Users tend to see the same stuff. They tend to have a rating system, a list of most preferred movies, viral videos. So why not just caching them here or directly into the user devices and in order to essentially eliminate the backhaul problem. At that point, you can go as dense as you want. You can have base stations, access points with enough memory to store a lot of information. In fact, just a little number here. Imagine devices with 100 gigabyte per device, which is more or less where we are now with, say, a good iPad. Imagine one device every 10 meters in a square kilometer. There are 10,000 devices. Well, this is 1,000 terabyte per kilometer square of distributed storage capacity. Okay, so it's quite big. So this is an untapped resource that we want to use. Now, what we have done. Now, this is all hand waving. Going a little bit more quantitatively, I am not going to bore you with equations, but what we have done, we have solved a few interesting problems. For example, a problem that we have called femtocaching. Imagine that you have a bunch of femtocells, say set-top boxes, with caches and connected with a bunch of users. Users want to stream video, and our problem is how to cache these videos in the femtocells. Well, this is an interesting combinatorial problem that can actually be approximately solved. And in the case of coding, using rateless codes, for example, fountain codes, it can be turned into a linear program. And so we have some results on this. Then we compare what we can do with helpers, caching helpers in a cell with what, say, a legacy LTE would do. And these are the results. It's without going into the details, but the green curve is the legacy system, and these blue and red curves are the combinatorial, say, uncoded cached information, and the coded one. And essentially, this gain is in a number of users or in the probability of outage, or when users can get what they want within the quality of service, the delay they want, et cetera, et cetera. So the gains are impressive. Another type of thing that we have done is, suppose that now you have these cached videos in the network, how do you stream them? Well, if you have just one client and one server, the way it works today, Silverlight, what Netflix does, is based on something called Dash, which is dynamic streaming over HTTP. Essentially, the client is going to retrieve one chunk of video at a time as if it was a web page using an HTTP access over a TCP connection, and is going to retrieve those videos with adaptive quality. What we can do now, we have a network. In every helper, we have several videos cached at different qualities, and we have users that want to do the playback. Every user has a playback buffer, and we want to transfer those chunks such that the playback does not stall. We don't want to download the whole 2-hour movie before watching it. We want to have maybe a few minutes of pre-buffering, and then we are going to see our movie in streaming. So, so we have designed algorithms that whatever the network topology is, and whatever we represent the coded video as essentially a two-dimensional array where we have time and level of qualities. For every level of quality, we have a different amount of bits per chunk, because the video is encoded in variable bit rate. And the decisions that the scheduler makes is an admission control decision, which is at which level of quality is going to request the next chunk from which helper. And these will be bits that get into the transmission queue. And then there is another decision, which is scheduling the rates on the links. And it turns out that when you pose the problem as a stochastic optimization problem, this problem naturally decomposes. So the optimal solution, or the optimal policy, naturally decomposes into these very well-defined two operations. One is admission control, and the other one is rate scheduling. And all these operations can be done in a decentralized way. Essentially, all what every nodes need to know is the length of the queues pointing at him. And this self-adapts if the user walk away or a helper shut down. The scheme takes into account. Of course, if you are in a very bad situation, you're going to get a very bad quality. But what can you do? So this is an example, for example, where we have a complicated situation where a user starts downloading from the base station, then there is a deep fade, then it gets to a place where there are some helpers. And here we see how the algorithm reacts. This is essentially the instantaneous bit rate for the various levels of quality. And we see, for example, that when the helpers kick in, the algorithm is going to be able to download to stream at the highest level of quality, while when the user is in a deep fade, the quality goes down. And this is the best you can do in these conditions. Another question that we have answered is what are the throughput and outage scaling laws? So now on a much more idealized model, assume that you have a grid of nodes, assume that nodes make demands according to a popularity distribution, and assume that every node has some cache, and they cache, for example, with a random policy. They cache randomly, but you can optimize the probability distribution with which nodes cache information. And now you have a very interesting trade-off, because if you make, for example, a cluster of communication, if you make the cluster big, well, every node has a high probability of finding what he's looking for, but when he actually retrieves these in one hop, you're going to consume a large area in your network. So you can only fire a few links in the node. If you make the communication range smaller, then you can activate many more links in parallel, because they do not interfere with each other, but the probability of finding what you're looking for is less. So in fact, you can find the sort of optimal trade-off between these two quantities in the sense of scaling laws, when the number of nodes goes to infinity, and see how these things scale. Okay, and finally, I will mention one additional benefit of caching. Caching can be used as side information. In other words, even if there is no hit to the cache, the fact that the users have access to cached data creates a sort of side information that can be used to turn the unicast transmission from the base station into a multicast. So at the end, the base station can only transmit a minimal amount of extra information to satisfy as many users. And this is just a simple example. Imagine that we have a base station. We have a user 1 wants file 1, but his local helper has file 2. User 2 wants file 2, but local helper has file 1. So what do? Well, send file 1 plus file 2, XOR. This is a very elementary application of network coding. In one downlink transmission, you satisfy both users. So what happens is that if you push this on a much higher scale, this is an instance of a very well-known problem. It's called index coding. And we have done some work on these, and we can actually show, for example, that we get factors at least, say, 2.4, 2.5, and probably even more by improving the algorithm, the coding algorithms, by using essentially, for the users that do not find what they're looking for in their cache, they still can use the content of the caches as side information, and so make also the transmission from the base station as a multicast, even though users want individual information. So going to a conclusion, I would say that, well, this project was a lot of fun. It kept us busy in the past 2.5 years. We have, I think, contributed quite a bit to the discussion in this topic. And now there are companies who are actually funded by Intel who are preaching caching at the edge for wireless. And then I asked Intel, so where do these companies come from? And they said, well, actually, we send them your white paper. So it looks like this idea is spreading out, is kind of becoming popular. And I think that what we still have a long list of things to do. And with this, I would conclude. Hopefully, there will be some nice technology transfer out of these ideas in this project. Thank you.
So I will try to make up a little bit of time here. I decided to put this particular slide up because I am different from others in CSI in so many ways, but here are the two obvious ones. As the sole mom on the floor and someone who works in a different kind of wireless communications, which is underwater acoustic communications. And I used to say that I dabbled in this, but after doing this for, I guess, about 8 or 9 years, I guess you are no longer a dabbler and you're fully ensconced. But like any good siren, I've been able to convince a large number of people to work on these problems with me. And part of my goal today is to talk about some of the fun problems that we've been addressing, but to also underscore that these unusual applications often tell us something new and interesting about the traditional applications that we care about. So let me start, and forgive me, Dr. Viterbi, but I will be referencing your talk a couple of times. So the first data point that I gleaned, or one of the data points that I gleaned from Dr. Viterbi's talk is that if you want to be one of the big giants, there are 2 places from which you should have completed your degrees if you were going to complete them. And luckily, I can check both of those boxes. I did complete my degree at Berkeley, and I did complete my degree at Princeton. So I feel that I have some hope for my future. So let me tell you a little bit about this particular problem. Clearly, no one has any question that cellular telephony has been a tremendous success. But of course, and Greg, this slide is for you, a big question you can ask yourself is why do we want to have communications underwater? Clearly, the fish don't need to talk to each other, although we have a lot to learn from a lot of the underwater mammals, like whales and dolphins, as they do use acoustic signaling in order to communicate. So the first answer that I would give you is that, well, water is everywhere. It covers 70% of the Earth. And if you consider what we know about outer space, we know much more about outer space than we do about the parts of the Earth that are underwater. But I actually have a more, perhaps, engineering type of motivation to look at these kinds of problems in this particular communication space, because this is an environment in which different aspects of engineering have to be coupled together. And I'm going to come back to this theme of communication, sensing, and control, but this is one of the reasons why I love this particular application area, because in order to solve the problems that I'm interested in, the research questions that we have to ask and answer lie at the interfaces of these 3 very important sub-areas of engineering, and that is communication, sensing, and control. So to give you some more concrete reasons as to why we want to consider this kind of application, I've listed these here. I'm sure there are many others that you can think of. But before I move on, let me just note that aquaculture in particular is a multi-billion-dollar industry which is only growing. And so the ability to monitor and understand and surveil is something that's going to become more important as time goes on in underwater systems. So one of the things that Dr. Viterbi talked about this morning was how we were moving away from a point-to-point communication system. And one of the luxuries for those of us who work in this area is that point-to-point is actually still very interesting, and there are a number of unsolved problems that lie in this space. There are numerous challenges with underwater acoustic communications, but the biggest one is the fact that we can actually never escape the Doppler effect. Now, I don't want you to think about Doppler from a narrowband wireless comm point of view. I want you to think about Doppler from high school physics, right? Where the example that was given to you was sirens and vehicles moving towards you and moving away from you. And in this wideband communication environment, I cannot pretend that my Doppler scale is in fact a Doppler shift. I actually have actual compression and dilation of my signals. This leads to a time-varying channel whenever I have mobility. The bad news is that it's always time-varying because water is always moving, even when the receiver and the transmitter are static. The good news is that the time variation has a lot of structure. And if we can be smart enough to exploit that structure, we can actually design good equalizers, transceivers, et cetera. And here what you see is an actual example of some data of a multipath profile as a function of time. And you can see that those paths are actually moving. They are scaling due to the Doppler effect. And so this is one of the things that we've been worrying about. How do we design communication receivers and signaling schemes to deal with this time-varying Doppler? To show you how things come in and go out, some of the work that we've looked at, which involves using very low complexity partial FFT designs for transceivers for the underwater case, we've translated to good carrier frequency offset estimators for OFDMA. research that we've done with Andy on designing channel estimation strategies for ultra-wideband channels involving a mix of so-called sparse and diffuse components, we've shown to be incredibly effective in underwater acoustic communication channel estimation. And we're now hoping with Eric Strom, who's visiting us from Sweden, that we will be able to parlay this also to vehicle channels. So things that we've done and other universes have come into play, and we've exploited what we've learned in this universe to more traditional terrestrial wireless problems. Let me give you another example of something that has turned out to be incredibly fruitful. One of the interesting things about this underwater environment and its coupling is the fact that everything in the environment affects the environment, which sounds a little bit obvious. But if I want to do something like sonar, where I'm trying to image, say, the ocean floor or objects on the ocean floor, the presence of those objects is going to change my signal. And that's how I detect presence or absence or what kind of class it is. But those objects in the field also change the channel that I'm going to communicate over. And if I want to do both communication and sensing, I need to take both of those things into consideration. And so this leads us to this very nice, abstract, we can pose it in information theoretic terms problem, where what I want to do is signal a message over a link. That message is going to be affected by some kind of channel state. And depending on what I know at the transmitter about this channel state, what I'd like to be able to do is to design my signals well, and at the destination, decode the message and estimate the channel simultaneously. And we've been able to close the gap between knowing nothing at the transmitter about the channel to knowing everything and characterizing what we now call the capacity distortion function of this particular link. And what we want to do next, of course, is expand it. So the building blocks of this kind of problem are the things that you hopefully remember from your USC days, which is a pure communication problem, in which case we often model the channel as being static. And what I want to do is introduce randomness into the signal that I transmit over this channel so I can maximize the amount of information I can receive. At the other extreme is estimation, where we typically send deterministic signals over this random channel in order to learn properties of the random channel. And you can see that we have this tension here between wanting to be random in my signaling for communication, but deterministic in my signaling for estimation. And as I said, we've been able to fully describe the tension in this case as to how you would do this. So if you want to know how to jointly do this, come talk to me later. So again, applications that go beyond my sort of perhaps niche problem of sonar include things like mixed analog digital radio, watermarking, data storage over memory with defects, trying to learn cognitive radio channels and communicate over those channels, help each other. So there's a lot of applications that we can do. So I apologize. I wanted to minimize the number of equations and things that are in my talk. But we have a recent result that I'm incredibly proud of and that I hope will lend some impetus to your pride in your Trojan history and Trojan spirit. And that is that this joint communication and sensing work has given us the tools to address an old toy problem. So in 1968, Witzenhausen proposed this toy problem, which said there was a lot of interest in distributed control. And the question was, if you had a bunch of distributed controllers in a single plant, would the right thing to do be to have all of those controllers be linear? And so he contrived this problem in which the first controller, C0, is nonlinear. It's a simple quantizer, actually. And the second controller, C1 up there, is linear, and showed that it outperformed with proper parameter settings any other linear schemes that you might be able to have with C0 and C1 being linear. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in the recent past, people have posed an information theoretic version of this problem, and there's been a race to try to figure out what was the minimum distortion possible in us estimating a key function x, which is shown in this picture. And I'm happy to state that we have beat Stanford and Berkeley in this race, and we have figured out what this quantity is. So it's of academic interest, but I'm very proud that we beat out those two institutions. So let's go back to this question of point to point, because in the end, also, if you remember that picture that I showed you at the beginning, I'm not actually interested in only communicating over a single link. I want to look at more complicated topologies. And in fact, I want these topologies, to go back to Dr. Viterbi's talk, to explore this notion of connectivity and explore this notion of mobility. We tend to think of mobility as users of wireless phones and people in cars as something that we control as the users. But if I have a larger network in, say, this underwater environment, I might want to control mobility in order to achieve some other kind of goal, whether it's a sensing goal or a communication goal. Now, controlling your mobility for communication is something that you do every day when you take 10 steps to the right and you ask your friend if they can hear you. All right? That's you invoking actuation in order to improve your communication channel. And we do this all the time. But the question is, if I have a larger holistic goal of sensing, communication, and control, how do I get all of those pieces to play together in order to let my system do what it's supposed to do? And one of the big questions that we've been asking ourselves is, how should nodes cooperate with each other? Should they collaborate in their communication activity? And this is something that we as wireless engineers have been working on for some time. It started out with multiple antennas, just in terms of transceiving and receiving. It moved on to multiple input, multiple output communications, where we invoke specialized codes in order to take advantage of all of the degrees of freedom that we have. But now we can also do this cooperatively, which is another big topic in communications. And so the question is, how should I get these individuals to interact? And the way we've taken a look at this is using a game theoretic approach. And in order to study this, we looked at basic building blocks. I've actually redrawn our classical MAC and broadcast channel that we study in wireless in the context of my underwater case. But the point again is that the statements we've been able to make in terms of assessing who should collaborate when, what kind of resources should they share, and will that collaboration be stable? That is, if I form a group, am I incentivized to stay in the group in order to maximize my own personal gain, which is going to be communication rate? And we've been able to do this. And one of the nice outgrowths of this is another sort of nice academic result, and that is we've been able to make a parallel result for this information theory paper that won a paper award, which showed the duality between multiple access channels and broadcast channels. Broadcast channels are notoriously challenging to characterize. And so when the Stanford colleagues came out with this work, they gave us a mechanism by which we could use the easier multiple access channel description to create results for the broadcast channel. Through our definitions of these games, we now have a duality result for MAC and broadcast for the game theoretic environment. Again, we came to this problem trying to satisfy our Navy sponsors and tell them how underwater vehicles should interact with each other. But to be honest, the results that we've come up with are perhaps most applicable to heterogeneous wireless networks with backbone, backhaul links, etc. So I started out telling you that I wanted to worry about communication, sensing, and control. And we addressed this first problem loosely. What happens if I have a message I want to communicate, but I also want to learn something about my environment? Now I want to get that control in there. And one of the things that I want to do is allow myself to potentially choose the channel over which I communicate in order to achieve some kind of goal. And this is, again, is related to some new information theoretic concepts, action-dependent communication, but really this is the problem that I want to solve. I have a field of sensors. They are sensing some kind of source. They take those sense signals, they communicate them, they compress them, they communicate them to something like an AUV, and my AUV is acting like a data mule, and it has to go across the field and collect as much information as it can while minimizing its energy cost. One of the other interesting things about this underwater space is that the cost of actuation is not that much more than the cost for communication, something that we usually don't think about when we think about terrestrial communications, where the movement of a vehicle is much more expensive than you using your cell phone. Here, I have to worry about every expenditure of cost. And what we are able to do is to take these new notions of communication with action and use them to design path planning schemes for AUVs. And so this is one of the things that we're worrying about. So what's the real world domination, goal that we want to do here? Is we want to come up with a holistic framework for studying the exploration versus exploitation problem in this kind of space, but in other kinds of spaces. If you're trying to learn an environment, you want to deploy resources widely, pick up information, but eventually you want to hone in on the object of interest or the goal of interest. And how you go from exploration to exploitation is one of those big sort of holy grail problems that people in many different kinds of disciplines are trying to attack. And I believe that us, with our tools in communications engineering and systems engineering, have the capability to formulate a problem that we can answer that will give us some insight into all of this. So I'm going to close with this particular picture. But one of the things that I hope that you've seen in this very brief sampling of the work that we're doing in CSI now is that communications is changing and evolving. And one of the things that I find exciting about being at USC is that I really do believe that CSI is at the forefront of initiating this change. And so I apologize, I kind of primed the pump when I asked Dr. Viterbi about our role in the future and the applications, but I think what you've seen in the 3 presentations is that now the research that we do is very tightly tied to the application, that the kinds of communication systems that we design and analyze are driven by the applications that we're interested in, and that yes, we absolutely do have a role to play in shaping this larger universe where the distance between the physical layer, we're not at the bottom of the stack, actually. You know, the notion of the stack has changed, and now everything is interconnected. So once again, thank you so much for coming. It's so great to see so many of you here. I've already had some very nice comments about interactions that people have had. This is a time to reconnect with friends, but also to make new friends. And of course, we're very selfish here as the faculty. We are also actively looking to reconnect with all of you, to get new collaborations going, to increase our interaction between us and all of you. And so thank you again.